screw you, exposure, screw you. I know that just last week, I did a video talking about the speed workflow process. I used the new PowerFlow 8 presets. I was showing you the grid edit and how you can use just a simple exposure adjustment to balance out your session and literally edit entire sessions in like 5 minutes. But seriously, enough with how we're using exposure. And today I'm going to show you why. Go watch the trailer for the Batman and see how much the exposure is pushed in that. Here's a film camera. Here's a digital camera from Sony. Here's a digital camera from Fuji. Guess what? It doesn't really matter. When we adjust exposure in all of these cameras, we're doing something real. Now fast forward to this digital sliders, now with AI, now with automatic, now with this, now with that. It almost seems like the art and craft of photography is becoming like a lost magic wizardry thing that you would read about in some fantasy book. For fast workflow, we need a baseline. But I was actually working on some other projects this week, and I was going over film photos and thinking about how we're really using exposure. Now, this isn't about film photography so much, but like always, I shoot a lot of film to do tests for improving the Filmus pack, and also because I love shooting film. Ultramax 400. Here is a roll of Ektar, 35mm. This is Ultramax 400. This is 4x5 sheet film on Portra 160. 4x5 again, probably T-Max. 35mm, Cine Still. 4x5 again. This one is Velvia 50, I believe. Look at the shadows on this. Just stop and look at the shadows on this for just 1 second. We keep forgetting something really important in our photography, and that's that the light you really see is defined by the shadow that surrounds it. That is contrast. Think about what we used to do for just a second. We go out and we have a roll of film in the camera and we choose not only the film, it's almost like our preset then, right? In terms of its color, even the lens also affects that. I'm working on a video about lenses, in fact. But here you are, and if you want to change the exposure, you adjust your aperture, your shutter speed, etc. Or you change the lighting conditions. Now we fast forward to our modern cameras and it's still similar. I change the exposure, I change the shutter speed, or I change the aperture now. If you've shot film, if you've shot Instax, you've probably kind of felt like no matter what you shot, there was kind of something magical about it. Was it all in your head? No, because exposure in film, you're thinking about it more. You're not just willy-nilly shooting and then saying, I'm going to crank it up in post. Yes, we can take these sliders on a film scan and push them up. In fact, most of your labs, when you send your film in, are doing that. That's why your shadows are all muddy and noisy, because they're stuck in this rut that we got to push everything up. All right, but enough film examples. Let me breathe, slow down, and show you what I mean by why we need to stop pounding the exposure slider. Now, there's been nothing done to this, and normally I would probably use a film preset, or I would go to something like the new PowerFlow 8. Let's just put something that kind of makes it pop. So I'm going to do Hollywood Blues to kind of bring out the color and the nuance. See what happened to the histogram here. I use very advanced recipes in my presets, and if you kind of want to see what I'm doing, go to the comments and I'll put some links to some free presets on my site that you can try so you can see these more nuanced things in action. I'm never using exposure as part of a recipe in a preset or a style or something like that. Let me reset this again. Here's our raw file. And here's this. It does feel like the exposure went up a bit. Let's reset and look at the histogram. Notice how we're kind of leaning towards shadow on the raw file, and we do lift it up a little bit. And if you look at the curve down here, you can see that I'm pushing the midtones and a little bit of the highlights, but then doing kind of a F-curve roll-off on those highlights to keep everything nice and smooth. See the F-curve video on this channel for more about that. But what I want to draw your attention to is we tend to say, oh, I want to post this online and I want it to pop. I'm going to turn up the exposure and then I'm going to drop down the highlights and maybe add some contrast, right? This photo is not terrible this way, but it just looks like every other whitewashed fence photo because we're all fixing photos with an exposure slider. Let's go back to this Ektar photo taken on the streets of Mexico City just real quick. There's a lot of color, there's a lot of light going on. Yes, we could process and edit this scan a little bit, but I want you to think about something. There's a lot of shadow. What film did automatically is it has shadow and contrast. It was part of the way the film was designed. But now what happens? We come in and we take a photo and we say, oh, let's lighten it up a bit, because we've been conditioned to lighten and push the exposure slider almost like taking a pill for a headache. Maybe what we did in camera had some reason. So you kind of have this preview in camera and you're shooting for that. And maybe you're exposing correctly. Maybe you're thinking about zones like we talk about in Shadow Hackers and my other workshops and other videos on this channel. Maybe you understand that you need that contrast. Then you get that raw file on the screen and you think, okay, it seems a little dark. But what often is a little dark is actually just a lack of contrast. Let's put an Agfa Vista 400 film preset on this. Okay, it looks good. It's still shadowy. Do we need to push it up? No. Look how we start to muddy up the shadows and you start to see everything. Instead, we can go and we can use something like whites, for example, right? What you're really trying to do most of the time is create more contrast, not actually increase your exposure. Remember what I said about when we're in camera. When we're in camera and we do exposure adjustments, we're creating something that actually affects the organic nature of the photo, the atmosphere, the movement. It could be shutter speed. It could be ISO and the grain it adds, but it could also be things like aperture and depth of field. We're doing real exposure. We're changing the exposure and the aesthetic of our photo, and that changes the creative output. But when we do exposure in digital, we're essentially just pushing up the gain. We're turning up the volume of the photo instead of changing its nuance. It doesn't matter if I'm in Lightroom or Capture One or here now in DxO Photo Lab. I can push the exposure up a stop, and then I can tweak with things like shadows and things like that to retain my contrast. But in the end, I'm using this baseline of just pushing up the gain. Now, this is okay in a workflow sense where you're going through a session, doing a speed edit, and you're trying to balance out where you may have missed a little bit on certain exposures to get the overall feel of your session right. But once you get into creative stuff, you generally don't need to see much from the exposure slider. That's why I say, screw you, exposure slider. We know what we're trying to create because we're using our head in camera, not an AI, not an algorithm. We're creating photos. Photos should have feeling. They should have soul. I could almost pull the exposure down. Notice what's happening though. We kind of flatten everything out and we darken everything. What happens if we stop doing it that way? What if we do things like use a curve? So we lift the mid highlights, we pull down the high highlights so there's enough roll off, we pull our shadows down a little bit, and we lift maybe our low shadows up a little bit. Notice how we did this just with this curve. In essence, we increase the exposure here. The secret here is that I can apply a preset, I can then come over and manually edit, and while occasionally a little exposure helps, exposure is not giving any life to the photo. On the other hand, the things we do in camera, the things we do carefully with curves where we're focusing only lights or only darks. For example, in the parametric curve, you'll see me using this a lot, where I might push up the lights and darken the darks, or push up the darks and darken the shadow. Real photos should have shadow. And I've started noticing this pattern across my photos, across the photos in my favorite books, across the photos that I actually win awards with. And it took me years to get to that point. But once you realize this, you start realizing exposure isn't what I need. I don't need to turn up the volume. I need to use the EQ, the curves, the blacks, the whites, whatever your approach is, the channels, the HSL, making the photo bright feels safe. It feels like it works, but what we're actually doing is ruining our edits. If you think I'm crazy about this, look no further than cinema, where they're investing hundreds of millions of dollars to create a mood. Shadow and darkness is everywhere. Now, that doesn't mean that all your images need to be low key, that they all need to be dark, or that never you should use high key. It doesn't mean any of that. It means that we need to stop using the exposure slider to fix what actually is a transition between what we see here in the viewfinder, in the visualization, and this somewhat flat image that comes out the other side. We need to stop using these dumbed down sliders like exposure and contrast to fix errors in camera or errors in our visualization. Even if I'm doing a HDR image, I need that shadow. I need darkness. I need contrast. If you want to take this to the next level, come to my next Shadow Hackers live workshop. I will put a link in the comments. And if you want to see more videos like this, leave a comment, hit a like, hit that subscribe and bell icon. Stop using the exposure slider. Start using your curves, your lights, your presets that are well formulated to balance out. Use your F-curve. All these techniques that work on digital, that work on film, that even work on your smartphone once you start realizing what you're actually seeing and what algorithms our computers are giving you. It's transformative because it gives you control over the drama, the mood, and the atmosphere of your photos. I hope this makes sense. Let me know in the comments what you think. And we'll see you next time.